From the critical role of performance testing in regulated environments to tools that make overseeing thousands of concurrent trials possible, you're about to get an inside look on how a large healthcare company ensures seamless performance and reliability with their clinical trial solution. Make sure to watch all the way to the end because you're going to pick up tips on how to apply these lessons to any performance project you might be working on. You don't want to miss it? Check it out. Hey, Lance, welcome to the Guild.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, really excited about this. I've been trying to get more and more testers involved in performance testing, especially in healthcare. So I'm just curious to know a little bit more about what you all do, maybe a quick intro about yourself, and then get into maybe clinical trials and the impact of performance on clinical trials as you're testing.
Sure. My name is Lance Ishimoto. I'm the VP of IT operations here at Medrio. So I manage the CI/CD team, which does the builds, also site reliability engineering, our corporate infrastructure, as well as security. So our role in clinical trials is we have a suite of eClinical solutions, which basically captures data. So whether we're working with sponsors or CROs that are conducting clinical trials, we help them gather that data so then they can submit that data to the FDA for approval, whether that's in phase 1 or phase 2 or phase 3 clinical trials. And so for us, being able to have a stable platform that is performant and makes the process as easy as possible for users of our systems to get that data into our systems and then reliably have it be transmitted then to the FDA is very important.
So, Lance, you're the VP of IT of operations, and I'm just curious to know, how did performance testing get on your radar? How often do you think about it? And if someone's listening in, back in the day, it was kind of hard to educate people why performance was so important. How do you get your VPs, your decision makers involved in knowing why performance testing is, one, important, and two, having the right tool in order to help you support your performance needs?
So it's for my team, one of the teams that's affected directly is the site reliability engineering team. So they're the team that's on call 24/7 by 365, right? So they're the ones that are seeing the first issues. So we have monitoring in place to look at load, system utilization, stuff like that, right? But what we are is we're at the end of the line. So we're seeing symptoms of things. If load testing is not performed, what ends up happening is we see the end result of, the system is very slow or whatever might be happening, right? So for us to know that something has been load tested and then also to know that any new things we're making are also load tested and also using that to say, okay, these are things that run slow for us. We noticed a lot of issues with this in terms of performance, or these are starting to escalate into longer load times or longer save times, whatever that might be. We need a way to then have developers and testers get that feedback and say, okay, well, where can we focus on this, or how is this happening? And then that's where a tool like WebLoad is really important. So anything that will help us build a load test is very important to my team, because at the time that it comes to us, that's already kind of too late, right? So if you see performance issues and that's in production, you're already having customers, users that are affected at that point. So you need to catch this problem way earlier in the cycle, as opposed to running into this problem now and then saying, okay, well, we didn't think about performance, so let's go back to the drawing board and try to make this more performant over here in the development cycle, right? So load testing is extremely important, because if it can't support that load, then everyone is getting alerts at night, and that's my team. So it's just more protecting ourselves.
How do you measure, how do you test that it's going to be reliable, or it's able to take a lot of data from different patients and making sure it's actually capturing the right things, and because it's FDA, that it complies with all the regulations that the FDA might have?
Sure. So what we have to do is we have to make sure that our software is validated because it's a heavily regulated industry. So as part of our SDLC, we have a very robust testing process. So we have to make sure that we, for all of the features that we have, and for every new feature as well as existing features and functionality, we need to be able to validate that it still works with a new release. And we have this validation documented, and we have a validation packet then that our customers will use, and they'll save, and they'll probably submit that to the FDA to show, hey, we're using software that's been validated. And it's just whether it's accurately capturing the data as we expect it to, but then also being performant, so that sometimes with these clinical trials, you may not be scheduling someone to come in. It may just be that a patient or subject really comes in and, all right, we're going to try this new procedure, this new drug, or this whatever it is on them. And so they need speed there because nothing has been scheduled. It's just on demand right there. And so having our application be able to be quick and perform is very important for our customers.
A little background, like the software itself, is it a handheld device? Is it different devices that then, like, could you have multiple people doing a clinical trial at the same time, and therefore you need to make sure it's able to handle, say, 50 clinical trials going on at the same time, or is that not realistic?
That's correct. So we have thousands of clinical trials that happen at one time. And it could be users from all over the world, right? So, and they can be coming in multiple different ways. So that they may be coming in as a browser, or they may be coming in on a tablet. And so being able to test different ways that they may be entering the system, whether that's a tablet, and then from there, the tablet's making communication to an API, or if it's a user coming in through a web page, they've got a website that they go to, but then there's multiple APIs within that service different functions or requests within the application.
All right. So how do you come up with a realistic performance test then? Say you need to make sure it's performant. You have all these applications, all these different areas coming in. How do you plan to make sure that that your system's able to handle all these different inputs and where they're coming from, and latency, and the load, and all that?
So we end up looking at different use cases based on patterns that we see from customers. So let's say if they have a form that they're entering things in, like maybe it's like height, weight, blood pressure readings, other stuff. We then look at kind of like how a normal form looks like for a normal study. And then maybe it could be, I say normal, but there could be different types of studies. So it might be an oncology trial, or it may be something else for a wearable device or something. Based on that, we then take some of those use cases from customers, and then we kind of create our own test studies and try to kind of mimic their behavior to see, and then say, okay, well, if there's a form that has like 100 variables on it, like it might be like different things like blood pressure, height, weight, stuff like that. It's a very long form, but sometimes customers do that. And so we want to be able to see, if we do that, how long does that take to then display that page if someone's looking at an existing subject, or how long does that take to save that if I have a new subject that I'm trying to enter data in for? And then maybe kind of figuring out then, is there a sweet spot of how many kind of variables you should have on a form versus should I just allow this to scale like infinitely linearly?
Yeah, so it sounds very complicated. So how do you know what kind of tooling to use? Can you give an example of maybe what you're using to be able to test all these different scenarios?
So we utilize, if we're just looking at normal just use cases, then we'll just be using kind of how the customer will do it. But to be able to do more structured performance testing, then we would be using like WebLoad from RadView to be able to do that testing, because we need to be able to test at scale. So it's fine to test individual connections, which anyone can do via a browser, but Webload makes it easy for us to test at scale, put in multiple variables, have number of streams or threads to make those connections to any services that we have.
Yeah, so I assumed it was more of an enterprise tool like Webload. I know a lot of people I speak to try to use maybe an open source solution and they miss out on ability to monitor a lot of things and reporting. So is there anything else like maybe in this tool that helps you to monitor what's going on or to actually give reports? I assume with the FDA, you need to make sure that not only did we test it, but here's proof that we tested this and here's something you can look at.
So we don't provide the tool that we use to the FDA in terms of kind of like here's the results from Webload, but what we say is like we expect that this result should happen when this request happens, and so and we've tested this for maybe 100 simultaneous users or something like that, making X number of requests per second. That kind of stuff is very easy to pull out of Webload to see, okay, well, what are the status codes that you get out of this? How long did each request take? What are kind of the high and low marks of that? And looking at averages. So at a very quick glance, you can kind of tell, okay, is this at the point where it's stable, or is it this point where maybe it's about to fall down, right? And so that makes it easier for us versus some of the other tools that we've used in the past, like Selenium, for instance. We find it easier to use and has more information for us.
Oh, that's interesting. So you find it easier to use than something like Selenium. Maybe give me a little more information, because a lot of people just assume, oh, Selenium's easy, but I assume for performance testing, it wasn't made for performance testing. So maybe a little bit around how a tool like maybe Webload is easier to achieve your objectives for performance.
Right, and so there's it's easier because it's made to scale. So Selenium, you might have to add different plugins to be able to have that functionality, and it's not maybe consistent because a lot of the stuff is done through the community, which is fine, but there's no gate in place for what can be in community, right? For plugins versus something that is obviously it's not free, but there's a certain level of quality that you get, and a certain level of features that we get with Webload that may not be naturally built in to something like Selenium or other tools out there that are just open source.
All right, Lance, I know in the performance space, there are a lot of tools. We mentioned some open source tools and why you chose Webload over them. But I'm curious to know, there's a lot of enterprise performance tools out there as well. Did you do any sort of evaluation process with these different, maybe say competitors, and maybe in the end, like which ones did you go against, and why did you choose Webload in the end?
Sure. So we did do an evaluation, and it's actually something that is kind of required with us in terms of picking different types of vendors, and so we look holistically at a number of things, right? So like we briefly touched on licensing and stuff earlier. So that's a component. Obviously, cost is a component as well if you're looking at some type of paid software. But for us, usability is a very important factor, right? So because we have a set number of people on our teams, and let's say we need to implement something with load testing, we need something that is very easy to use and extensible for those that know how to do it, because we have a wide range of users that are using this, and they may not have the expertise in load testing. So to be able to have QA users who aren't familiar with load testing kind of be able to use the tool pretty easily made it seem like this was a good choice for us. And so that's ultimately why we went with Webload. So if you're comparing like usability, cost, the kind of the certainty and licensing that we're comfortable with, it made it a good choice for us all around.
All right, Lance, I know a lot of times when people are evaluating tools, they just go like with the popular tool, not really looking at their particular situation and what tool will fit what they need. For example, I know a lot of teams that are looking at performance tools. They may just try something like Load Runner, which is pretty popular, and other tools like that. So I assume Load Runner was one of the tools you evaluated, and if so, how did it stack up with WebLoad? How did WebLoad come out on top?
I think the tools were similar, but WebLoad ended up being a little easier for us to use, and also the price was much more palatable for us. So we when you consider that, and everyone's kind of they're limited by funds, and so for us, if we can spend those dollars somewhere else, that can help us improve, right? So having a tool that has the same features but is easier to use and is more price effective for us, then that's why we chose WebLoad.
So I'm just curious to know, like a lot of times when you run a performance test, you get a lot of data, and sometimes it's hard to get actionable insights out of all that data or to interpret the results. Is there anything specific, maybe like with WebLoad, that helps you get to those results easier or able to see actionable insights without having to really dig deep and be a performance expert?
At a very high level, so for us to look at all of the dashboards that WebLoad has, make it very easy to kind of see at a high level generally what's happening, and then we can then use those to kind of dig into certain requests that we think are hitting certain methods, or that not we think, but we know are hitting certain methods, and then we can kind of dig into the performance there and look at other profiling tools that are local to the code, and then kind of see how that affects things. And because we can change, let's say, the number of requests, the number of users, the number of requests that are happening at any minute or second, and then also change the amount of data that's put in for like payload, that allows us to then dig into things a lot more to see how certain types of requests can influence performance.
Another pain point I find is sometimes people run a performance test in staging, and then it goes to production, and it doesn't match what you saw in staging or what you tested for. Any real world examples of maybe how you used WebLoad and how it helped maybe find actual issues before it was rolled out to production, or any types of information like that?
What it helps us really is just testing at scale, because when developers are doing it, and we have different Scrum teams who are their QA teams that are attached to the Scrum teams, they're testing. The data is at a much smaller scale, and the number of requests that you're hitting against the development systems are much smaller than what you would do. So staging for us is a controlled environment. So we end up doing change requests and release forms just like we would do in production. So it's a much more regulated environment, and the hardware is scaled a little bit higher. So then what we can do if we're using something like WebLoad is load it with a lot more data, but then also do a lot more requests on there. So if we're doing hundreds or thousands of requests over an extended period of time, we're able to kind of see those things, and then we can kind of iterate faster before we get back to or find the issue in production. And we also apply some of this on the development side as well. So what we do is our progression, it goes from a number of development environments to kind of a main development environment, and those get promoted to staging and our validation and production environment. So the faster we can iterate earlier in the life cycle is much better than doing it in production, right? Because then you have an issue with customers having the problem, and you may have to take a downtime, or you have to make other changes and fit when that downtime can be. But also the main thing is it's affecting customers. If you can find that early in the development cycle, like in dev or even staging, that's a much lower cost than finding that issue in production, from both a user standpoint as well as just the teams that have to deploy those things, because there's more resources that are involved on the staffing side, right?
Almost sounds like you could use it to figure out what the perfect architecture is before even starting to build it, and shifting it left with performance helps you know what you need in place before you even invest all your time in building something.
Yeah, if you can see that load testing in the architecture design, and you're doing that on the development side, iterating there is much cheaper to fix a problem, and then you can know you're building it from the ground up, that it's performant, versus at the end of the line this is much harder. It's like trying to change how your house is, right? So if you're like, oh, I need to move houses because this land is horrible, then you can't really do that after you've built the house very easily. But if you do some testing before, then you would know, okay, I don't want to do this here, right? So it's the same kind of concept basically for performance testing and load testing. You need to be able to know from the beginning that it's going to be able to support that load, as opposed to already at the end of implementation.
Yeah, 100%. So do you know ahead of time how many people are going to participate in a clinical trial? So you almost do like a POC, like, okay, we know this clinical trial is going to have 10,000 patients. And so we need to make sure we can handle it before we actually roll it out. Is that how it works normally?
To some degree, yes. So a sponsor CRO may know what the expected enrollment of a study is. So it might be, like you're saying, a few hundred patients or a few hundred subjects, or 10,000 subjects. But we have, because we're a multi-tenant SaaS solution for clinical trials, what we end up having is, if you have a couple thousand clinical trials running at any time, even if one has 5 subjects, let's say, but you have 10 that have 10,000 subjects, and you have several hundreds that have hundreds, and then you have some really large ones that are maybe 40, 50,000 subjects, they're all concurrent. And so being able to support that load, we can't just do it where we assume that it's going to be a certain level that's fairly low kind of on average. It's got to be, we have to be able to support what peak load looks like. And so we definitely need a tool that can help us test at that level, which is something that WebLoad can do for us.
I also assume all these environments are different. I would assume not every clinical trial is the same and has the same hardware in the background. Maybe I'm wrong. And if I'm wrong, if I'm right, that they all have different how do you test for different hardware setups or different web server configurations and things like that? Different environment issues that everyone must have different, top types of hardware involved that could impact performance.
Sure. So from our standpoint, because it's a multi-tenant solution, we have to be able to support all of those things. So we have to be able to make sure that you may have a small study sitting on the same hardware as a larger study, because they essentially are running on the same kind of pool of infrastructure. And so that's how we end up testing with WebLoad in the development environment against like kind of single sets of smaller number of servers. But then when we're going to staging or validation or production, we're testing from all of our infrastructure at that point. So development is just internal. But then once we go up to something like staging, we're looking at all of our load balancers is going through a web application firewall. It's going through normal firewalls. There's IDS or IPS involved. So WebLoad is actually simulating many users at peak levels of traffic against all of the infrastructure, which is very important for us to see, because it may not necessarily be a code issue or an issue with the actual servers or databases. It might be something like, well, there's a threshold on applying a certain number of firewall rules or web application firewall rules, or maybe going from this region to another region, you start seeing some type of latency and there's too much chattiness that's happening. And so that kind of helps you then figure out, okay, well, this is an issue. We're seeing long response times for this. What service is it hitting? What are the parameters that are being used and why that's happening? And then we can kind of then dig into it to see why. And so being able to simulate that type of traffic is very helpful for us.
So performance testing back in my day was a really niche thing. It was hard to find someone with the skills to do performance testing because you needed to know, the C language and all that. Who does performance testing at your company, one, and how easy is it to get up and running with, say, a tool like WebLoad?
So performance testing is done by kind of two different groups at Medrio. So developers will use it because they'll want to do some testing on something prior to handing this off to QA. So they'll do testing, and then we'll also have our QA team will do some automated testing with WebLoad. So we have two different groups with two different distinct skill sets, I would say. And so the tool is easy enough to use and robust enough that someone that can do more coding, let's say, on the dev side, can use it and make it work for them. But then you can all go all the way to the other side where maybe some of the QA team that is more just doing functional testing, graphical testing, they can then configure that so that they don't have to have a lot of knowledge of scripting, let's say. So it's a very easy tool to use for a number of our groups here.
How about support? I know performance testing is not always easy, especially in clinical trials. One thing a lot of people go with the tooling is because they need support. So have you ever had experience with WebLoad support, and how was it?
Sure. So the WebLoad support has been great. We actually don't have to use support very often, which is maybe a testament to how the tool is, right? But when we have called into support, I don't think I've ever heard of an issue. I mean, that's the truth, right? If it's easy to use and you don't have to call in very often, then it's a good tool. And when we do have to call in for issues or write in, I think they've been answered very quickly. So it's easy to use and there's great support.
So nowadays AI is all the rage, and I know there's a lot of tools coming out with AI support. I'm aware WebLoad has some cool AI features in it as well. Is that one of the reasons why you may have chosen it also? Is that something that was part of your evaluation process?
So it wasn't initially part of our evaluation process, but it is one of those things that is a nice to have. And now, because we've had WebLoad for I think several years now, but we now are moving more towards AI tools as a company at Medrio, and having that ability is very important, because then you can look at maybe things that, just as I was talking about, WebLoad is easy to use, maybe things that you wouldn't think about. So if you had AI that said, okay, well, we see these types of requests, so we're going to try to do additional requests against that, then that would be very useful for us, because then that expertise may not be with whoever is using the product, but then they can get that insight because WebLoad has made that apparent to them. And then the other thing is, because one of our big things is compliance, and we talked about licensing, software licensing earlier. One of the biggest issues with us with AI is that who owns the data, what data is shared out. And so knowing that we already have an existing vendor in RadView makes it a lot easier to kind of bring in new AI tools. So if we're already using it, it's a lot easier. We already know the licensing terms and the data use terms that we have. So I'm more comfortable as someone who has to vet software and approve software and track it, to have a company that we know what their usage is of our data, if they even use it at all. And it may be self-contained in some cases, because we run WebLoad locally. And so that's not necessarily reporting out back to RadView. So there's a lot more comfort there in terms of enabling AI features.
How easy is it to use RadView WebLoad to create these realistic scenarios?
It's very easy for us to create these scenarios to test, because what we know is we can see within WebLoad what types of requests are slow, and then for what we do is we then dig into what the data is from requests for customers as they use our system, right? And so what we might do is we'll make requests where, like, this type of request is slow for pages with like 50 or 100 variables on it. So this is just like items in a form, right? but it might be fast for something that's like 25 variables on it. And so then that allows us to then go back into development and then figure out, okay, let's try to hammer this with web load and see how that decrease in performance is. Is it linear? Is it exponential? Is it whatever? Right. And then kind of iterate on the development of it. Okay, well, why is this slow? Is there like a stored procedure or something? But at least what it helps us do is focus on what is slow. And then we can dive down deeper into that, whether that's something from the code and the database or whatever. So being able to identify how that's slow and be able to test in different scenarios is really important for us. And WebLoad makes that really easy. It helps us also when we're trying to look at things that aren't even actual usage patterns that we see now. So we see like we have maybe a new study that might start and we expect 5 times the number of subjects, right? And maybe we expect a ton of concurrent use versus what we typically see. So we use WebLoad in those cases too. So it's not that we are testing what the top end of current requests look like from real live data, but maybe 2, 3, 4 times that amount, and just to see, okay, can we support something like this now? And if not, how can we support that in the future? And so it helps us look at kind of a whole range of things. So stuff that we know that we can't support now, well, how slow would that actually be? And what can we do to then make that something that we could take on as a provider?
Right. So if someone's listening in and they work for healthcare or a clinical trial company, any tips you can give them, or maybe how to get started, or things you found out, you should know about this before you start really ramping up your performance testing efforts?
Probably the thing is just being able to profile how your users use the system, and then if you see any kind of outliers, know that those outliers may become a majority at some point. So you need a way of mimicking that at scale. And so if you're looking at something like that, you need some way of doing that. And that's where WebLoad has really helped us out to kind of look at some of the more, we'll call it egregious calls that are happening against the system, and be able to do those at scale and see what that does. And then you can kind of then suss out other performance issues like, okay, well, why is this slow? And then we've taken things where we've had some requests that have taken a long time, and we know that they take a long time at scale, but we're able to see that of using a tool like WebLoad to do that at scale. And then we've been able to cut down the time, so save times or load times of certain methods or requests by using WebLoad, and then kind of iterating on that into the development cycle. So it's been a very critical tool in our performance testing and just the development of Medra's platform.
Thanks again for joining us for this awesome discussion on performance testing within the healthcare industry. As Lance highlighted, robust testing tools like WebLoad can make a significant difference in ensuring your platforms are reliable and compliant. So if you're looking for a solution that can handle extensive scalability and detailed monitoring and is wicked easy to use, it's time to check out WebLoad. Give WebLoad a try today and take your performance testing to the next level. Click on the link below to learn more and start your free trial now. Don't let performance issues hold your development back. Check it out.